Hi, my name is Elliot Smith. I'm a sophomore at Linden High School, and I'm involved in leadership here at the church through leading in 4th and 5th grade ministry and through leadership in my own youth group. I really enjoy leading a 5th grade boys small group and also leading in various capacities at my own youth group with my own peers. I know it's what God is calling me to do because I've experienced his deep love and I've experienced what he can do in my heart, and I want that to happen in other people as well. So in any way that I can do that, in any way that I can help others feel that same love, I would like to do that. And that comes at a price, and that's being bold. So I'll do whatever I can to help do that. Yeah, in my everyday life, it's often difficult to find ways to really show that you love Jesus and that you want to love like Jesus. If you just take confidence and take boldness, which I had to learn. But now that I take confidence and boldness at the high school or in my own atmospheres, it is just so rewarding to know that you are being kind, you're being loving, you're being bold for Christ. You're trying to spread Jesus' love in every little way that you can. Whether that's wearing a shirt that says something about Jesus on it, or whether that's not giving into the temptation of other people around you, showing that maybe this person is a little bit different. It can be scary sometimes, but it's often the thing that sets someone who's living bold apart, but it's not easy to do. But I feel like God has really given me the strength to do that and the strength to be bold even in my own circles.
So proud of Elliot and some of the other high school students that are jumping into leadership here in the church, but also like Fellowship of Christian Athletes. They lead some of the middle school groups and things like that. And it's so inspiring for me to see these young people get involved at such a young age in being bold and being leaders. So good things are happening. Well, we're talking about bold living in this series. That's the topic that we've got, really in a godless culture. And so today we're going to look at what it means to be a faithful follower, how to thrive in this Babylon, how to influence your culture. And this chapter is a letter that's written by King Nebuchadnezzar. So this is actually the only letter in the Bible written by a pagan. And it's one chapter in the whole Bible, but he writes this letter to talk about really what God did with him and how God worked in his life and in his heart through this next story that we're going to talk about. And also how Daniel worked in his life over the last 30 years. So what we're going to talk about today, chapter 4, is 30 years after the very first time that Daniel and the boys met the king. And so a lot of things have changed. So let's jump into chapter 4 this morning, Daniel chapter 4, starting in verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all the peoples, nations, languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. That's his greeting, right, to all the people. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. And I want to just pause and say that for the last 30 years, Daniel has really been revealing God to King Nebuchadnezzar through bold living. And God has been working through the boldness of Daniel, through the boldness of his friends, which exposed the king to God's miracles, the supernatural power of God, the holiness of God through Daniel. And so really what we're talking about is the last 30 years, King Nebuchadnezzar has experienced Daniel's immovable faith in God that revealed God to the king. That's bold living. That's why we're talking about bold living in this series. That faithful followers reveal the faithful God to godless people. So that's number 1 in your notes today. Faithful followers reveal the faithful God to godless people. So we should just review a few things this morning to catch us up. Maybe you weren't here for the last week or two. So chapter 1, we remember that Daniel and his friends stayed faithful to the values and the rules that God had given them about their dietary laws. And they stood up for what they believed in, even at high risk, and God blessed them. And they ended up rising to prominent leadership in the land. So that's number 1. They stood up for what they believed. Chapter 2, Daniel was bold, remember, in asking the king not to kill the wise men. We kind of joked around and said maybe he should have asked, just let it go and kill all the wise men, right? The competition. But he didn't. He asked that their lives be spared. And then he asked for more time from the king that he could hear from the Lord and then bring forth the meaning of the dream and the dream itself. So Daniel did that boldly in chapter 2. Then chapter 3, if you remember, we had the three boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, staying faithful to worship only their God. And they remained standing when everybody else in the land was bowing down to the music, and God delivered them from the furnace. And here's the point I want to make about this, is that through the last 30 years, Nebuchadnezzar has been influenced and impacted by their faith. If you remember what the young men said when they were about to go into the furnace, they said, "O king, our God is able to deliver us." Remember that? He is able to deliver us, but even if he does not. Would you say that with me this morning? Even if he does not. That should be on our lips every day as we face the different things that we go through in life. Even if he does not, we will not bow. So one of the questions we ask today is what do we do with the even ifs of life? Those times in life when God allows us to experience difficult things, hard things, dark times, loss, disappointment, the even ifs, God allows us to be in the furnace. And I want to ask the question today, and just think about that as we work through this text. Is God's presence enough for us? Is he good enough for us when we go through hard times? Do we believe he is good enough for us? And so now that brings us up to speed, and the king has another troubling dream. 30 years later, after the first dream, and he kind of knows it's about himself. He knows that God's speaking to him, but he really wants to be sure because it's a terrifying dream. So he calls his wise men, and they can't give him the answers, and so then he calls Daniel. And Daniel finds himself with another opportunity to speak the truth, but to speak it with love and speak it with compassion. So here's the dream, verse 4. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was living in my palace in comfort and prosperity. But one night I had a dream that frightened me. I saw visions that terrified me as I lay in my bed. So I issued an order calling in all the wise men of Babylon so they could tell me what my dream meant. When all the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, fortune tellers came in, I told them the dream, but they could not tell me what it meant. At last, and you kind of get the feeling that he's been waiting for Daniel to show up, right? At last, Daniel came in before me, and I told him the dream. He was named Belteshazzar after my God. So remember, Daniel and Belteshazzar, they're the same guy, okay? Don't get confused by that. He was named Belteshazzar after my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar recognizes that Daniel and his friends are special. They have the Most High God, the Spirit of the Most High God living in them. Verse 9, I said to him, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the Spirit of the holy gods is in you and that no mystery is too great for you to solve. Now tell me what my dream means. I want to pause just for a minute. And let's talk about for a minute what we see here in these 30 years. Because, we hear about the dreams and the things at the beginning, the furnace and all that. And then we hear about this dream. Well, there's 30 years in between this where Daniel has been consistent. He's been bold. He's been humble. He's been in leadership. He's had this interaction with the king over all these years that has resulted in the king trusting Daniel. And Daniel, as far as we know, has consistently spoken truth. But as we're going to see in this text, he does it with compassion. It's not like, I'm going to tell you what's wrong with you, king. It's not like, I'm going to tell you what you should do or shouldn't do. But Daniel now has a reputation as one who knows God and has a proven track record of hearing from God. So over 30 years now, the king has learned to trust Daniel's ability, and he acknowledges the God who lives in Daniel, who gives him this ability. Daniel has proven himself in a pagan culture, and he's never compromised his faith in God. He's never bowed down to the other gods. Even though he's been forced to become Babylonian, he's Babylonian in almost every way, in his culture, in his language, in his education, and even in his name, Belteshazzar. He's Babylonian now. He's still faithful to worship only Yahweh, the only true God. And so now you see the king, instead of being angry and frustrated that people don't know the meaning of his dream and giving way to his anger and threatening to kill people, you see kind of a change that's happened in this king. And because he believes in Daniel and he believes in Daniel's ability and his relationship with God. And so over 30 years now, the king has become a trusting believer in Daniel and in Daniel's ability. So let's read on. Verse 10. The king goes on, while I was lying in my bed, this is what I dreamed. I saw a large tree in the middle of the earth. The tree grew very tall and strong, reaching high into the heavens for all the world to see. It had fresh green leaves, and it was loaded with fruit for all to eat. Wild animals lived in its shade, and birds nested in its branches. You see this picture of provision, right? All the world was fed from this tree. And then as I lay there dreaming, I saw a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven. He saw an angel. And the messenger shouted, "Cut down the tree and lop off its branches. Shake off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Chase the wild animals from its shade and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump and the roots in the ground, bound with a band of iron and bronze and surrounded by tender grass." Hang on to that picture, okay? It's significant. "Now let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the wild animals among the plants of the field. For 7 periods of time, let him have the mind of a wild animal instead of the mind of a human." Now, most scholars will say, and it's going to come up later in the text, that what the dream meant was that he was going to live with the cattle. He was going to live with all the domestic animals that they had. And in fact, there was a name for this. It's lycanthropy. And it's when somebody actually has a mental condition that they identify with being an animal. No, it didn't start in the last 10 years in our schools. It started thousands of years ago with a king named Nebuchadnezzar. And in his case, it was a mental condition in that he truly believed he was an animal. And he went out and ate grass with the cows, okay? "For this has been decreed by the messengers." Now, the word for messengers is really the word for watchers. So the idea is that you have angels in heaven that are watching the things that are happening on the earth, watching man, watching what's going on. And so one of these watchers or one of these messengers comes, and it's been decreed, it's been commanded by the holy ones, so that everyone may know that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world. This is the purpose for the dream, and this is the purpose for what King Nebuchadnezzar is going to go through. That everybody will know. And here it goes. He gives the kingdoms to anyone he chooses, even to the lowliest of people. "Belteshazzar, that was the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now tell me what it means, for none of the wise men of my kingdom can do so. But you can tell me, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you." So again, we see that the king recognizes the difference between Daniel, his friends, and all the wise people, the magicians, sorcerers of his land, in that they have the Most High God. They have the one who imparts his wisdom and imparts information to them, interpretations of dreams that they can share with the king. So really, when you read this, it seems like there's not a whole lot to interpret about this dream. It's pretty clear. I think what the king probably wants to know is this going to happen to me? Is this me the dream is talking about? But still, he asks Daniel for the insight, because Daniel had been so consistent in revealing God and revealing God's information over and over to the king. And so he trusts Daniel. And he trusts that whatever Daniel's going to say, it's going to be said for his benefit. So verse 19, "Upon hearing this, Daniel, also known as Belteshazzar, was overcome for a time, frightened by the meaning of the dream." And I want to suggest to you this morning that Daniel was not frightened for himself. He had been through this drill enough times. He had risked his life enough times. I don't think he thought he was at risk with the king. I think what he was frightened about, and what scholars will tell you, is that he was frightened for the king. He saw this dream, he understood immediately what it meant, and he knew what was in for the king's future. And he was overcome on behalf of the king. This was hard for Daniel. This is good for us to know that this was hard for him to deliver this message, bring this bad news to the king. And for a time, he was overcome with fear. I'm just going to say it. It was fear, but not fear for himself. It was fear for the king. So number 2 in your notes today, faithful followers, you and I, in the culture that we live in today, Elliot mentioned it in his testimony, faithful followers face fear with faith. Say that 10 times really fast. Faithful followers face fear with faith. When you are called to be a faithful follower, when I am called to be a faithful follower, there's sometimes fear involved. Sometimes we have to stand up for the right thing. Sometimes we got to get involved with situations we don't want to be involved with. Sometimes we have to deliver bad news or hard news. There's fear involved. It can be uncomfortable. Or maybe it's just standing up to the culture, standing up to what everybody else is doing. That would be the high school kind of fear, right? It's awkward. And most people don't love it. They don't love conflict. It's hard. But what I want you to know today is that it's normal for people who are followers of Christ, faithful followers of Christ. It's normal to face some fear, and that's okay. Somewhere along the line, we've been taught that fear is wrong, fear is bad. No, fear is normal. How we face it, how we work through it becomes the decision, right? Faithful people have to face fear. Decisions don't come without distress. There's almost always distress that happens in our lives when we face tough decisions. We wrestle, we worry. And it's mostly about others. It's mostly about how's this going to impact so-and-so or whatever's going on in our lives. How's this going to impact them? We wrestle with this. And Daniel was overcome with this because he could see the horror of what the king was going to face and what was going to happen to him. And Daniel was overcome, frankly, because he cared. And the reason I say that today is because, when we stand up in our culture and we bring a different message than what is the culture, it's countercultural. When we stand up and do that, I think we can be tempted to do that out of, we're going to show you what's right. We're going to tell you the truth. We're going to, you're going to have to change, turn or burn, you know what I mean? Kind of a thing. But that's not the right way. The right way is to do it like Daniel, and you share because you care. Daniel cared about the king. After 30 years of working with him, the king had done some good things in his life, had elevated him in the culture, in the leadership. And so Daniel, I think, and the king had this friendship. They had this relationship going on where Daniel could have easily said, okay, king, finally you're getting what's coming to you. You threatened us and we, got thrown into the furnace and you threatened to kill us and now you're going to get yours. Or that could have even been going on just in the back of Daniel's head, right? But Daniel was not driven by resentment or unforgiveness. Daniel was driven by compassion. And so for Daniel, after 30 years, it's like, oh, king, everything in me hates what's going to happen to you. But here's the truth. And then the king said to him, Belteshazzar, don't be alarmed by the dream and what it means. Again, I want us to see the tone and how the tone has changed over 30 years. Not only has Daniel got compassion for the king, but now you got the king encouraging Daniel. Don't worry, Daniel. 30 years ago it was, tell me the dream or die, right? You see the difference? Now after 30 years of this investment in relationship, it's, Daniel, don't be alarmed by the dream or what you have to tell me and what it means. It's funny how things can change over a long time of investing in people and caring about people. And now the king has shared this terrible premonition of what's going to happen to him, and now he's encouraging Daniel, don't be alarmed, and he invites Daniel in that moment to speak the truth. So you see Daniel, 30 years, faithfully serving, faithfully revealing God to the king, and he doesn't want to give the king the bad news, but the king has learned that good things happen when you trust Daniel and you trust his God. And so Daniel, faithful follower, faces his fear with faith and delivers the interpretation. Why? Because he knows God is in it. He sees God working in it. Let's pick it up in 19b. Belteshazzar, or Daniel, replied, I wish the events foreshadowed in this dream would happen to your enemies, my Lord, and not to you. Another subtle difference you see from now to 30 years ago. And now he's saying, man, I wish this is the stuff that would happen to your enemies, not you. And then he calls him my Lord. And in the previous chapters, chapter 1 and chapter 2, he calls him, O King. But now there's a different tone to this. There's this sense of respect and maybe even affection where he calls him my Lord. You are the Lord of my life here in Babylon. I mean, I worship God Most High, but you are my Lord underneath God Most High. And he says, I hate that this is going to happen to you and that you're going to go through this. And in this moment, Daniel cares for his captor. He cares for his captor. Pick it up in verse 20. King, the tree you saw was growing very tall and strong, reaching high into the heavens for all the world to see. It had fresh green leaves, was loaded with fruit for all to eat. Wild animals lived in its shade. Birds nested in its branches. That tree, your majesty, is you. For you have grown strong and great. Your greatness reaches up to heaven, and your rule to the ends of the earth. And then you saw a messenger, a holy one, come down from heaven and saying, cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump and the roots in the ground, bound with a band of iron and bronze and surrounded by tender grass. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the animals of the field for 7 periods of time. Some scholars believe literal 7 years. Some scholars believe that's just God's perfect timing. Okay, 7 is a perfect number, right? But whatever it is, we're going to go with 7 years, just for the ease. Verse 24, this is what the dream means, Your Majesty, and what the Most High has declared will happen to my Lord, the King. You will be driven from human society, and you will live in the fields like the wild animals. You will eat grass like a cow. You'll be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses. But the stump and the roots of the tree were left in the ground. This means that you will receive your kingdom back again when you have learned that heaven rules. I want you to notice this about God. And this is the thing that I think we want to remember about God today, is that even when we go through dark times, God leaves a stump and a root in our life that is going to come back to life in the right time. It's going to come back to life. It's going to flourish again. We're going to have back what the locusts have eaten, right? And God's going to renew and restore our lives. And this is typical about God. God does this. And of course, the big picture of this is eternal life, right? The stump and the root of Jesus, and we're going to have eternity with him. But God also does this in our lives. And so I want you to remember that when you're going through a dark time, don't despair, because there's a stump and a root. And it's surrounded by tenderness, the tenderness of God's heart, the tender grass. And it's also bound up in bronze and iron, his hand, his firm hand in your life. And that God is going to restore your life when you have learned that heaven rules, okay? So I just want to pause for a moment and remind you of that, and to say that I believe there's somebody in the room today that just really needs to hear that. I think there's somebody in the room or watching online that you're going through a hard time. You're discouraged. You're disappointed. What happened was unexpected. You've suffered loss. You've suffered grief. And you need to know that God is with you. You know, Joel said it today when he prayed that his presence is with us. And if you walk out of here with nothing else today, I just want you to be encouraged that God sees you and that there is a stump and a root that is ready to flourish again in your life once you've gone through this difficult time in your life. God will restore you. I believe that's his promise to us. But then Daniel says, oh, but King, there's a way to avoid all this. You can avoid all this. You don't have to, this dream does not have to come true in your life. And here it is, verse 27. King Nebuchadnezzar, please accept my advice. Please. You get the pleading of Daniel to his Lord the King. Stop sinning and do what is right. Break from your wicked past. Be merciful to the poor. Perhaps then you will continue to prosper. And again, you get the feeling that Daniel really cares for his king, and what he tells his king is coming out of a compassionate heart for him, that he doesn't want his king to suffer. He doesn't want his king to end up eating grass with the cows. He wants his king to avoid this punishment. And that's number 3 in our notes today, that faithful followers speak truth, but they speak it with compassion. It's not for self-gain. It's not for resentment. It's not for unforgiveness. It's not for the upper hand. It's none of that. Faithful followers speak truth with compassion because they care. Proverbs 15:1, it says, a soft anger turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So what does it mean to be a faithful follower in a godless culture? I think partly it's what Daniel has shown us and his friends have shown us over 30 years, and that is to stay true and to speak truth, but to do it with compassion, to do it for the right reasons. Now, I'm telling you, in our culture, it's easy to do it for the wrong reasons. It's easy because, we have this thing called self-righteousness or justification. And we want to rise up and we want to tell people how it is. But we've got to check our hearts and make sure that we're doing it with the right motivation. And that is because we want them to avoid eternal punishment, right? We want them to avoid eternal punishment and to know Jesus. That's why we want to do it. And so like Elliot shared this morning on the testimony, we take a firm but a friendly stand. We take a firm but a friendly stand. It's got to be motivated by compassion. We speak truth for the benefit of the other. And it might put us at risk of rejection. We might lose friends. But Daniel cares for the king. Clearly, this is what motivates him to speak up. Please, king, accept my advice. You hear the pleading. Again, Daniel could have had a little fun, made it sting a little bit. You know, this is what you get, king, for being such a jerk. But that's not what he did. He felt compassion and he felt fear for what the king was facing. Sadly, though, even though Daniel tried to warn the king, these things did happen, and here's how it went down. Verse 28, all these things did happen to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, a year after the dream, a year God gave him. 12 months later, he was taking a walk on the flat roof of the royal palace in Babylon. As he looked out across the city, he said, look at this great city of Babylon by my own mighty power. Uh-oh. You know, this is exactly what God was talking about. Nebuchadnezzar, I want you to see me as supreme ruler over the earth. Even what you've accomplished, Nebuchadnezzar, I've allowed you. I've allowed you to be in position. I've allowed you to flourish. I've allowed you to succeed. I've allowed you to be the greatest ruler the earth has ever known up until this time. And the first thing out of Nebuchadnezzar's mouth, look at this great city of Babylon. By my own mighty power, I've built this beautiful city as my royal residence to display my majestic splendor. Now, my wife and I were on a walk the other day, and we were talking about this text, kicking it back and forth. And she says, you know, if he knew this was going to happen, and he had a year to decide not to, live this way anymore, not to raise himself up above God, then why did he continue in his pride? And I said, well, why do any of us continue in our pride? Why do we do the things that we know we're not supposed to do? And it's because for him, and I think for us, we get this great sense of value from accomplishment. We get this great sense of value from success. We get this great sense of value when we think we've done it, right? But God wants us to know in our hearts that he's the one in our lives. And in fact, that all that we need comes from him. And he is enough for us, even when we're in the darkest times. And that's why he allows us to eat grass with the cows. He allows that in our lives so that we'll come to our senses and we will allow him to become the ruler of our life. We're not very good at ruling our own lives. We really do need him to rule. So verse 31, while these words were still in his mouth, a voice called down from heaven, O King Nebuchadnezzar, this message is for you. You are no longer ruler of this kingdom. You will be driven from human society. You will live in the fields with the wild animals. You will eat grass like a cow. 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses. Here again, even as heaven hands out this punishment, this consequence to Nebuchadnezzar, even as that happens, we see God's grace and his mercy in Nebuchadnezzar's life, because he could have easily just killed him, snuffed him out. He had every right. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar, stole his people, captured his city, took his stuff, right? Nebuchadnezzar stole from God. God could easily have just gotten rid of him, got it over with, but he chose to give him another chance. And that's another amazing thing I just want to raise about our God. He's the God of endless chances. It's like he never runs out of mercy. And God is merciful to give Nebuchadnezzar another chance to change. And it's my experience that God lets us go through crazy times sometimes so that we'll come to him for sanity. I think that's what God does for us. And when I say crazy, I'm not talking necessarily mental illness. I'm talking about just life. Crazy life, right? You know what I mean. The craziness of life. Why? Because he loves us. And he wants us to turn to him. He wants our identity to be in him, not in anything else. He wants us to trust that he is good even when life is bad. And he wants us to discover that he's enough for us no matter what happens in our life. That is God's agenda for you and for me. And sometimes he'll let us eat grass with the cows. I like to eat cows. Eat grass with the cows so we can figure it out. So here it is, verse 33. That same hour, the judgment was fulfilled. Nebuchadnezzar was driven from human society. He ate grass like a cow. He was drenched with the dew of heaven. He lived this way until his hair was as long as eagle feathers and his nails were like birds' claws. They didn't even let him go get his nails clipped, you know? Verse 34. After this time had passed, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven. And I want you to remember that line. After this time had passed, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven, and my sanity returned. And I praised and worshiped the Most High and honored the one who lives forever. Now, this is the king who once said, you must bow down and worship the idol that represents me every time you hear the music play. And now he is saying, because of what I have gone through and God has allowed me to experience, I lift my eyes to heaven and I honor and worship and praise the Lord Most High. His rule is everlasting. His kingdom is eternal. All the people of the earth are nothing compared to him. He does as he pleases among the angels of heaven, among the people of the earth. No one can stop him or say to him, what do you mean by doing these things? When my sanity returned to me, so did my honor and glory and kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored as head of my kingdom. It's remarkable to me that after 7 years of insanity, they still wanted him to rule, right? That tells me he was truly a remarkable, remarkable leader. And so they put him back in authority in his kingdom, and he was restored. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and glorify and honor the King of heaven. All of his acts are just and true, and he is able to humble the proud. You know, I think that there are times that we all end up eating grass with the cows. And sometimes it's just life. Sometimes life puts us there. But sometimes it really is God allowing things to happen so that we will come to that realization that we need him. I've had that happen in my life, and I think it's true of all of us. And so I was asking God, how do you want me to end? And there's like several ways we could go with the end of this message. But I really, truly believe that there are people in the crowd that are struggling and suffering, and you find yourself in the fields, and you find yourself feeling a little crazy about life right now. Maybe it's a dark place, maybe it's a health issue, maybe it's finances, maybe it's your family, maybe it's your friends. But you find yourself in that place where what you need to do is look up to heaven.